Somewhere in Morocco, there is a pattern on a wall that has no beginning and no end. It covers the floors of palaces, the walls of mosques, the courtyards of houses that have stood for 700 years. It is made of broken pieces of glazed ceramic, each one cut by hand, each one fitted against the next with a precision that leaves no gap and no overlap. The pattern never repeats itself, not in one tile, not in one room, not in one building. If you followed it long enough, across every surface it has ever covered, in every country where it exists, it would continue forever without ever producing exactly the same arrangement twice. In 1974, a mathematician named Roger Penrose proved that a pattern like this was possible. He called it aperiodic tiling. It was considered a significant mathematical discovery. The craftsmen of Morocco had been making it by hand since the 13th century. No one is entirely sure how. The art is called zellij. The word comes from the Arabic for small polished stone. It begins with a square of clay, fired in a kiln and glazed in a single colour. The glaze side faces down. The craftsman works from the back. He cannot see the finished surface as he cuts. He uses a small hammer and a blade called a menkak to chip the tile into shapes. Stars, triangles, elongated hexagons. Forms that have names in Arabic but no direct translation in any European language. Each shape must be exact. A fraction of a millimeter off and the piece will not fit. There is no correction, no adjustment, no second chance. The piece fits or it doesn't. A skilled craftsman can cut perhaps 200 pieces in a day. 1 square meter of finished zellij requires somewhere between 200 and 300 individual pieces. A medium-sized fountain, the kind you find in the courtyard of a Moroccan riad, might require 30,000. A palace requires more than anyone has ever counted. Here is what makes zellij strange. Most patterns repeat. A repeating pattern has what mathematicians call translational symmetry. If you slide the pattern in any direction by a fixed amount, it looks exactly the same. Wallpaper works this way. Floor tiles work this way. Almost everything works this way, because repetition is how you cover a surface without gaps. For centuries, mathematicians assumed that any pattern which covered a surface without gaps had to repeat eventually. It seemed obvious. It seemed inevitable. In 1974, Roger Penrose proved this was wrong. He constructed a pattern, now called a Penrose tiling, that covered a surface completely, left no gaps and never repeated. It had a different kind of symmetry. Fivefold symmetry, the kind you see in a starfish or a snowflake, the kind that had been considered mathematically incompatible with infinite tiling. Penrose's discovery was celebrated as a breakthrough, a new kind of mathematics, a pattern that should not exist. In the Darby Imam Shrine in Isfahan, built in 1453, there is a pattern on the wall with fivefold symmetry that never repeats. In the Alhambra in Granada, built in the 14th century, there are patterns on the walls that mathematicians have spent decades analyzing. In dozens of mosques and palaces across Morocco, there are zellij panels that, when examined carefully, produce the same aperiodic arrangements that Penrose spent years constructing with pencil and paper. The craftsmen who made them left no explanation. The people who make zellij are called malams. The word means master, but it means something more specific than that. A malam is not someone who has learned a skill. A malam is someone who has been given a skill, by someone who was given it before them, in a line that goes back further than anyone can trace. There are no written instructions for zellij. There are no manuals, no diagrams, no geometric proofs. The shapes have names, but the names are not written down. They are spoken in workshops by masters to apprentices, the way a language is transmitted before it has an alphabet. An apprentice begins by watching. For months, sometimes for a year, he watches the malam work and does not touch the tools. Then he begins to cut simple shapes, then more complex ones. The training takes years. Some apprentices never fully arrive. The eye for the pattern either develops or it doesn't, and no amount of instruction can force it. What the malam knows is not a formula. It is closer to a perception, an ability to see how shapes fit together before they are cut, to hold the entire pattern in the mind while working on a single piece no larger than a thumbnail. How this perception produces patterns that mathematicians could not describe until the 20th century is a question that no one has fully answered. In 1982, a material scientist named Dan Shechtman was examining an aluminium alloy under an electron microscope. What he saw stopped him. The crystal had five-fold symmetry. This was impossible. Every textbook said it was impossible. Crystals, by definition, had repeating structures, and five-fold symmetry cannot repeat. Shechtman stared at his results for 2 years before publishing them because he knew what the response would be. The response was exactly what he expected. He was told he was wrong. He was asked to leave his research group. The most famous chemist in the world called his findings nonsense. In 2011, Dan Shechtman was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the discovery of quasicrystals, structures with five-fold symmetry that do not repeat, that cover space completely, that should not exist and do. The pattern in the Derby Imam Shrine predates his discovery by 529 years. The malams of Morocco were not doing crystallography. They were not doing mathematics. They were cutting pieces of glazed clay with a small hammer and fitting them together by eye. And they produced something that science took until the 21st century to fully understand. There are two ways to think about this. The first is that the malams intuited something true about the structure of space, that the human eye and hand, working together over generations, can arrive at mathematical truths without ever naming them. That craft knowledge is a form of knowledge, different from formal mathematics, but not inferior to it. That what the hand learns, the mind eventually discovers. The second is stranger. It suggests that these patterns are not inventions, that they are discoveries, that the aperiodic tiling exists in nature, in the structure of matter itself, and that the malams were not creating something new, but finding something that was already there. Following a logic that precedes language, precedes mathematics, precedes the very idea of a proof. Both explanations are, in their way, more interesting than the alternative, which is that it was a coincidence. Because it is very difficult, looking at the panels in the Derby Imam Shrine, to believe it was a coincidence. The malams are still working. In the Medinas of Fez and Marrakesh, in workshops that have occupied the same streets for centuries, masters are still cutting zellij by hand, still teaching apprentices by demonstration, still producing patterns that have no beginning and no end. The secret of how they do it, if it is a secret, if it is not simply a way of seeing that cannot be written down, has not been lost. It has simply never been found, not in the way that mathematics finds things, named, defined, proven, archived. It exists the way it has always existed, in the hands, in the eye, in the gap between what can be explained and what can be made. The pattern continues. It has never repeated itself. It will not start now. And somewhere in the geometry of it, in the angles of the cuts, in the logic of the fit, there is something that knew what it was long before anyone had the words to say so. That is kept.